Let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we thank you and we praise you for the gift of your forgiveness and the chance to draw closer to you during this season of Advent as we prepare for the second coming of Jesus by remembering the first coming. We ask this in the name of Jesus, the Lord. Now we're in chapter 4, and we're in the second half of verse 3. So I'll read it to you. It says, "Your cheeks behind your veil are halves of pomegranate." One of the interesting things, if you study, literature in the Muslim world, they have a very vivid description of the way a woman's body is supposed to look. And what he's doing is pulling this out. Like curiously, her stomach is supposed to be like a persimmon. I don't think that's in here. You should be able to see her cheeks under her veil, and so anyway, that's what they're saying. "And your neck is the Tower of David, built in layers and hung around with 1,000 bucklers, and each the shield of a hero." And first of all, they're describing her neck as a tower, and that's, again, that was one of the things considered part of beauty, was a long neck. I don't know if you know, there's a very famous painting called The Long-Necked Madonna. And it's a Madonna, and the neck is really long, but it's actually a very beautiful painting, but it's a neck length that you've never seen on a human being at all, And so this idea of a roundabout with 1,000 bucklers, each one of them a shield of a hero, what they're describing is a chain, that goes around, and they're describing it on the woman's neck basically as a necklace. But as they go through it, then they go into the thing of the tower, and the tower would have these chains that would go around it, and on the chains would be the shields of the people who are in there. So you know who they are. I think you know that what we call shields are of two kinds. There's a ceremonial shield and an actual defense shield. And so the ceremonial shields, you could tell who was in the building because it announces the person. It's a coat of arms. Whereas when you begin to deal with the real ones, they work in a different way. Okay? So anyway, going on, he says, "Your breasts are two fawns, twins of a gazelle that feed among the lilies." And again, just this kind of a description of her body. He says, "Before the day breeze rises, before the shadows flee, I shall go to the mountain of myrrh and the hill of incense." Myrrh and incense are both saps from a tree, and they, as you know, make these, the incense. And so he talks about these, and he says, before the day breeze rises. So what he's going to do, he's going to meet with her during the night. He's going to meet with her during the night, and he promises to do it. And he does it in this way. Something to know is that myrrh and frankincense among the Jews are very, very, established things. Myrrh was principally used in embalming. Myrrh was, I mentioned it's sap from a tree, but they would heat it and get it liquid, and they used it, like for instance on the pharaohs, on their corpses, it would seal it. It was like lacquer. When it would be hardened, it would be like lacquer. And so this was used as part of the embalming process. Frankincense, by law, could only be used in the temple. And in the Jewish scriptures, there's a death penalty connected with burning frankincense on your own. And both frankincense and myrrh were used very frequently in pagan services, one way or another, as burning them. The Jews did not use myrrh burning. They used that with regards to the embalming. When the Jews entered the Holy Land after the Exodus, they brought in many of the practices that they had learned in Egypt with embalming, and not nearly as elaborate as the Egyptians. But this was one of the things they brought back, that a body was coated with this myrrh. So, and I think you know that at the gift of the Magi, frankincense and myrrh. Frankincense symbolizes Jesus' divinity, because again, it can only be used in the temple. And myrrh symbolizes the fact he's a human being, because what distinguishes us as human beings is the fact that we must die, okay? And so that's put together. And he says, "How beautiful you are, my love. There is no blemish in you." And again, it's the young man speaking of the person he loves. And if you're talking about someone you love, you don't see blemishes in them. You know, it's just this no blemish. Now, the next part, again, is sung by the man, continues on by the man. And this is verse 8 of chapter 4. So he goes on, he says, "Come with me from Lebanon, my bride. Come from Lebanon, come on your way." Now, Lebanon in the Mideast has a lot of trees and things. We oftentimes talk about the Lebanon cedars. But one of the things that's peculiar to them, the cedars that grow in Lebanon are very similar to the redwoods here in the way they water themselves. So that these trees in Lebanon actually water themselves from fog, that the fog comes up on the hills of Lebanon off the Mediterranean. It condenses, and then they rain it right down on their own, roots. And simultaneously, you have a lot of fern grow there. So it's very, very, very lush, and that's very unusual in the Holy Land. And one of the reasons why he speaks of calling her from Lebanon is that Lebanon, in, I guess I would say colloquialism, came to mean a garden. So Lebanon means a garden. So he's calling her from the garden. He says, "Look down from the heights of Ananus, from the crests of Seir and Hermon, the haunt of lions, the mountains of leopards." Now, he's talking, these are all mountains in Israel. And he says that they are the haunt of lions and the mountains of leopards. At this time in history, they had an indigenous lion, and since it's extinct. It's very much like the African lion, a little smaller and less of a mane, but it's very, very similar if you would see it. And they also have leopards in that area. They used to actually have white leopards there too, but they died out there a while back. He says, "You ravish my heart, my sister, my bride. You ravish my heart with one glance of your eyes, with one jewel of your necklace." This, my sister, my bride, it's very common in the Mideast for husband and wife to refer to one another under the titles brother and sister. They are not related. In fact, in the Jewish tradition, and I think in the Muslim, but I'm not sure, that they prohibit marriage, within a certain degree of kindred. And so they have very strict regulations about that. Most societies I know do. But it's very, very common. And actually that stems from Egypt. Again, when they were in Egypt, I think you know that the Egyptian, the pharaonic family, was always a marriage between a brother and a sister. And they regarded, because they were divine and no one else was, so they married one another. And I don't know how to say this delicately, but they were luckier than the British royal family in the number of crazy people they produced. They didn't produce a lot of crazy people, you know. So anyway, so he says, you ravish my heart with a single glance of your eyes, with one jewel of your necklace. And we've seen several references to jewelry. In the Mideast, people do not put money in the bank because banks fail and stuff like that. What you do in the Mideast is you buy gold jewelry and you put it on your wife. And that's also part of the thing of the black thing they wear, that you wouldn't want everyone to know the amount of jewelry they have on them. But that is their bank. Their bank is the jewelry their wife wears. So, what beauty in your caresses, my sister, my bride. And initially he was talking about visual beauty, and now he's talking about the beauty of their being physically involved, okay? And he says, how delicious your caresses, more delicious than wine. How fragrant your perfumes, more fragrant than all spices. And I think the thing here is he's going through this elaborate description, but the fact of the matter is any piece of jewelry looks better on the woman you're in love with than it looks as a piece of jewelry. Any perfume smells better on the woman you're in love with than does the perfume itself. And what he's getting at is this whole relationship. Now remember, the idea here is that this woman symbolizes, in the Jewish tradition, symbolizes Israel. The Christian tradition symbolizes the Christian church. And it's the idea that there are all sorts of really important things in the world. Let's say wisdom, you know, you have great wisdom teachers, but the wisdom that God sees in his people is better than the wisdom he sees anywhere else because of the love of his people. Same thing with regards to this thing. And I think sometimes we never fully understand what it is to be loved by God. It's very interesting. I think everyone in their life has fallen in love with other people. And when you fall in love with a person, it transforms them physically, everything. You know, that's a whole different thing when you're in love with a person. And we never understand God as being a victim of that. But God is. God really deeply loves, you know. I think if you've ever read the Screwtape Letters, one of my favorite lines in it is where Satan, in complete frustration, turns to the devil he's writing to, and he says, I have no idea what he sees in that vermin. And it's this idea that if you're in love, that transforms everything. It's not the other way around, you know. So, your lips, my bride, distill wild honey. Honey and milk are under your tongue, and the scent of your garments is like the scent of Lebanon. Okay? Now remember, Lebanon is the thing of the garden. So again, he's just talking about her. He says, she is a garden enclosed, my sister, my bride, a garden enclosed, a sealed fountain. Now, what's he talking about this? He's talking about the fact that, and we're going to go through a little more of this, that in a relationship with a person, you come to know the person in a way that no one else really knows them, if you really come to know a person. And I've mentioned this in class, but the thing I always think of in my mind is that if you talk to any newspaper editor in London, they know more about the Queen than Prince Charles, because they've been working at that all, but they don't know the Queen. That's what Prince Charles does. Prince Charles knows her, okay? And that what happens is that this knowledge of understanding a person is sealed within the person, and the person must reveal it. So that I could list everything that, let's say, I know about the Queen of England, but the Queen of England would have to enter a relationship with me for me to ever understand, really about her. And I think it's amazing if you look in, particularly people who study biographies or history or something. I think it's really amusing that you can know a huge amount about a person that you don't know. And it's very different to know a person and to know about them. And this knowing a person is a sealed thing. Only that person can reveal it to you. You cannot on your own come to know anyone. You can know about people, okay? And I think that's one of the things that is a real problem sometimes in news reports and stuff, that we can know what a person does, but we don't know what's involved in their doing it or what brought them to do it or anything like this. I think I've mentioned to you that in my life, I think the most important thing to strive for in the world around me is mutual comprehensibility. That if you understand why I do what I do, you'll be very sympathetic to me, even though you may regard what I'm doing as absolutely crazy. At least you'll know why I'm doing it. When I was in Spreckles, there was a big deal with regards to a very, very violent clash between the pro and anti-abortion groups, one of the things. So the town asked me to do something about it. And so, because as you can imagine, the Catholics on both sides of it. So I took the leaders of the group, and we brought the whole group into the parish thing. And I took the leader of the anti-abortion group, and I took the leader of the freedom to have the abortion group, and I took them in, and I assigned the leader of the group that is wants no law against abortion. I assigned her to present the position of having a law, and the one who was in favor of the law, I assigned her to present the position that there should be no law. And I said, to go through it, study it, and really know it, and came out. And it was interesting. Both their presentations were very good, and they could defend logically all of this. They just didn't believe the conclusion, but they could do it very well. And it ended the conflict between the two groups. They didn't change the positions of anyone, but it ended the conflict because you didn't look at the other person and say they were crazy or insane or immoral or anything. Say it's a very different view than I would want, but it's, I know why they hold that. Mutual comprehensibility is a real key in human life. To be able to, you don't have to agree with a person to know why they think and act the way they do. And that's a very, very important thing. But it's closed. You have to, you have to open that up to one another. He says, your shoots form an orchard of pomegranate trees bearing the most exquisite fruit. The pomegranate is the most ancient symbol of the Jewish community, and it is used very strongly in medieval art. That if you see pictures of the Virgin Mary with the child, you will very often see a pomegranate in the picture. And because we've seen it come to represent the church. If you remember the high priest in the robe that he wore, around the bottom of the robe there were bells, and the bells were spaced by pomegranates. And the bells were out of the old pagan tradition that the sound of the bells is supposed to scare the demons. So the bells were supposed to keep evil spirits at bay. And the pomegranate, as representing Israel, was supposed to draw the attention of God. And those two things were just, woven through the whole thing. And the reason the pomegranate is a symbol of the community, I think this is another thing that's very important. It's because in a pomegranate, once you take it apart, you cannot put it back together. And the reason you can't is because no two seeds are shaped the same way. You have to have every seed exactly in its place. Not like an orange where you could just put the pieces together and still end up with an orange. You can't do that with a pomegranate. And to understand that every person in the church is different. There are no two people exactly the same in the church. And that's by God's intention. That's sort of the way it works. So, he goes then to what he calls the most exquisite fruit. He says your shoots form an orchard of pomegranate trees, but they produce this kind of fruit. They produce nard and saffron. We all know what saffron is. Saffron is the pollen off a certain kind of stem. And the idea of nard. Nard comes from Tibet mainly, and it has the consistency of honey. It has the color of a ruby, and in the plant, the nard comes out of a thick stem, much like a calla lily, and they roll a rock over it, and this liquid comes out, and it's highly aromatic. And the way it was always transported, it's probably refrigerated today, but the way it was transported in ancient days was in alabaster. They would take a piece of alabaster, carve out the inside, and put it in. You remember with the story of the woman who anoints the feet of Jesus, she breaks an alabaster jar and uses the nard. And it's very expensive. And I don't know whether its use is the same today, because most scents are artificial. But nard has a most wonderful scent, and it's very, very strong. So, calamus and cinnamon with all the incense trees, myrrh and aloes with the best spices. And I think there are three things going on in this. Number one is aloes. They're talking about healing. The aloe was used largely for healing in the ancient world. And when you get to incense, we're talking about scent. And using cinnamon, we're talking about taste. So what he's doing in going through this, he says that you're like shoots come out of you like shoots off a tree, and what it's really producing is this something that touches all the senses, and so that she becomes inclusive with the thing that goes on. So he says with aloes, with the best spices, a garden fountain, a well of living water, streams flowing down from Lebanon. Now they go back to the thing of water. Remember, in the Jewish tradition, water equals life. Okay, so she actually has become his life. Now think of it think of the Jewish community as actually being the life of God. And you see God's involvement with the Jewish community through the Jewish scriptures, his direction of them, his concern for them, his destroying of enemies, his protecting that his life, if you ask what God's doing in the Jewish scriptures, you would say Israel is what he's doing. This is like a 24-hour job. And we see that in the Christian scriptures as well, but in reference to the Christian community. And I think to understand that God's 24-hour-a-day job is human beings of all different ilk, background and everything. That God's real involvement is in human beings. And it's curious, if you study sacred literature, if you go through the Upanishads of the Hindus or the, forget what they are in the Buddhist tradition, but you go through them in the Buddhist tradition, you find out that in all these different traditions, the whole thing is God's involvement with people. And obviously, the involvement with the one who's writing the tradition. But this particular of God's involvement. And so he's saying that that's God's full-time job, and what flows from him in this job, in fact, is life, the water. He says, "Awake, north wind, come wind of the south, breathe over my garden to spread its sweet smell around." Now remember, what he was saying was that he was coming to see her at night, so he wants to actually find her. And so what he wants is that the winds carry the perfume to the area so that he can find her. And when I was a little boy, my grandmother used a very specific kind of perfume, and it's made in Paris. It's called Jacquet. And she got a little tiny bottle of Jacquet when she was a teenage girl, and she loved it. She used it through her whole life. And anytime I ever smell it, I think immediately of her. Anytime I ever smell it. You don't smell it very often anymore, because they have all different kinds of brands now. But when she was a little girl, they didn't have a lot of kinds of perfume, and they were all natural. So as I mentioned, natural perfumes are kind of rare today. That it's cheaper to do the artificial scents. So he asks that he can use that. And then she responds, "Let my love come into his garden. Let him taste its most exquisite fruits." So he's asking that the wind would carry the scent, and she's asking that God would allow him to come into the relationship. And this, of course, its most exquisite fruits is a reference to the sexual union between the two people as they're coming together. And now he responds again. He says, "I come into my garden, my sister, my bride. I pick my myrrh and my balm. I taste my honey, my honeycomb. I drink my wine and milk." And again, this is a description. If you remember, these qualities were mentioned of her earlier. And what he's basically saying, again, is the sexual union. The only thing I would mention there that you may not know about is balm. Balm is amazingly sweet smelling. And if you had ever been at the Easter Vigil, chrism is normally flavored with balm. That's where that scent comes from. And a balm is made from the sap of balsa wood, and it has a strong scent. Okay? So he says, the chorus says, "Eat, friends, and drink. Drink deep with lovemaking." Now this chorus we mentioned is a group of women singers that constitute a chorus as part of the thing. And they say, "Eat, friends." I'd like you to notice the use of the term friends, because in a valid relationship always begins with friendship and then can graduate to a love relationship, but it must begin as a friendship. That's how this thing is supposed to work. So he recognizes their relationship at first as friends, okay? And again, I don't think many people think in their minds of the relationship with God as being a friendship. One of the things about friendship creates equality. And if you're involved in this kind of a relationship, you render yourselves equal. And I think it's a curious thing in society that, we have strata in society. We see it more formalized in other countries, but everyone has strata in society. And people very seldom make friends outside the strata. And that's because, you recognize the equality you have with people. But this idea of equality, you don't want to, let's say, lower your status by having this equality with some. I think, even a place where you would see this is the relationship between people and their pets. The equality is created. You go into, I went to a home in Spreckles, and there were 3 women in the home who had been nuns, the 3 of them, with an order that was suppressed, which is the Immaculate Heart Order. And so they were, 2 of them were nurses and 1 was a medical doctor. And so they worked in the hospital but maintained this little community. But they raised, as pets, they raised Irish deerhounds. And I don't know if you've ever heard of an Irish deerhound. An Irish deerhound is the tallest dog, okay? Now, it's not the biggest dog because they're very thin and they're very elegant animals, very long legs. But anyway, I would go to dinner there, and if you're sitting at the table and an Irish deerhound comes up, his head is above yours. And so, and they expected the things to come up and eat from the table and stuff like this. And you think, how crazy. It's not crazy if you own the dog. It's very different. You're surprised what people put up with if they own the dog. And that's because the friendship, in a really good friendship, no one is in charge. That each person is kind of at the service of the other person. There's no such thing as a head friend and a second friend. It doesn't work that way. And I think we really forget that with God, that in this relationship with God, it is essentially a friendship relationship. And as soon as God entered that relationship, he was ultimately going to die. Having a cross, that's what Jesus did on the cross. Because to become equal to a human being is to live under the threat of death. That's how you are human, that there's very little. We don't think much about it normally. We try and avoid it. But the one thing that hangs over our head all the time is death. And, it can occur like that for any reason, at any time, any place. And I think it's really curious that in the way we kind of protect ourselves, that if I were in the hospital after having a cancer surgery, someone could come in very concerned about my death, about the fact that I might die, and I in that situation would be very concerned about my death. But they could come in totally concerned about my death and actually be hit by a car in the parking lot, and they could be the dead one. There's no rhyme nor reason to death, and it sort of hangs over us. There are times when we become aware of it, times when we don't. But for God actually to enter into this relationship with us, he had to be under the threat of death. And he did that by becoming incarnate in Jesus Christ. So, now she's in the apartment. Remember, he's seeking her out and stuff. And I told you, like they've described the consummation of the relationship, but now they'll go back to the meeting again, because these poems were not composed as a single one. They're individual poems. She says, I sleep, but my heart is awake, the sound of my lover knocking. So she says, I'm asleep, but in my sleep, I'm alert enough that I can hear when he is knocking. I'd like you to know in their structure of buildings and stuff, that's not easy, because when they go into a building at night, they seriously lock it up, and it's, they aren't in the room where the front door is or anything. And so she's listening for it. But I think all of us have been in a situation like that where we're for one reason or another very attuned. The best common example is a mother with a baby, that she catches it and as naturally attuned to it. But we've all been in situations one way or another. Now he is at the door, so he says, "Open to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one." Okay, so we've gone through all this before. He says, "For my head is wet with dew, my hair with the drops of the night." So he's come to her in the evening, and you have the dampness in the air and stuff. And basically he's saying he's cold, okay? So that he asks her to open. He says, "I have taken off my tunic. Am I to put it on again? I have washed my feet. Am I to dirty them again?" The tunic is the outer garment that you take off. It's the idea that he's ready to enter the house. He's washed his feet. He's taken off his tunic. So he asks, "Am I, just to put all this on and go off again?" Now it's her again. She says, "My lover thrusts his hand through the hole in the door." Now, the hole in the door, in inside doors, you had a hole in the door so that you could unlock it. Like for instance, we use doorknobs and stuff, but inside they would have a sliding thing that would sort of lock the door. So you wanted to go in, you put your hand in, and that way you could keep the door closed, but it wasn't really locked. They didn't lock doors. So that didn't lock inside doors. Through a hole in the door, so his hand's there. "I yearned for him to the depths of my being. I got up to open to my love. Myrrh ran off my hands, pure myrrh off my fingers, on to the handle of the bolt." So she's going over to the door where he was reaching in, and as she's reaching down towards the bolt that he's, opening, that she describes all this perfumes and everything. "I opened to my love, but my love had turned and gone." Okay? And what's really contained, if you look at the early part, she talks about him, the door, and says, oh, she's describing it and doing all this sort of thing, and she's waiting to respond. And when she responds, it's too late. When she goes to the door, he's gone. One of the things to understand in this relationship with God, there is a grace that is called prevenient grace. And prevenient grace is that when God gives you a call, he gives you the grace to respond to the call, always. But prevenient grace isn't there after a while. Prevenient grace comes with the call. So like, for instance, God would call me to do X and give me the grace to do it, and then I take too long to think about it, and then I no longer have the grace to do it. I had the call, but you need both the grace and the call. And I think probably most of us, and I don't know whether this is a really good example of this, I think most of us have at one time or another had very noble thoughts or ambitions. You know, I'll spend the rest of my life as a missionary in Mozambique or something like that. And you have this powerful, powerful move. If you wait a while, it goes away, okay? It just goes away. Now, sometimes that's a sign of sanity. Sometimes it's an opportunity missed. You know, and I think, you know, when you watch saints, that was one of the things about Francis of Assisi. He never got a suggestion from God that he didn't act on. And it was just crazy how his life was going. Same thing with Mother Teresa. You watched it was just like craziness. And that's if God sent her the grace and the call, she did it. Just simply did it. So now she responds, "My heart failed at his flight. I sought but could not find him. I called out to him, but he did not answer." So he's gone now from the door, So she calls for him, and then she looks for him, and she can't find him. And one of the things about the relationship is that a relationship, while it is a shared relationship, begins in someone's initiation. Someone actually starts the relationship. And in this relationship with God, you and I must always react to God. God does not react. God acts, he has a set purpose and this sort of thing, and the way he deals with us. And it isn't as though I can decide when God will speak to me. God decides when he'll speak to me. I decide whether or not I'm going to listen, but I don't get to decide when God speaks. And I think one of the curious things of human life, you can be in any kind of circumstance, any kind of situation, and suddenly feel this powerful, powerful relationship with God. And then other times you could sit down and pray for hours and nothing happens. It is all entirely on God's side. And the idea as a human being is to kind of be aware of that. You know, one of the things they did at the Vatican Council is that I think you know an office, a priest says that office has been greatly shortened for priests today. And so we have the office, we say, but one of the things the Vatican Council says is that as you're going through this saying of the office, you should be alert to the fact that God might speak to you. And if God speaks to you, don't think you need to finish the prayer. Listen to God. The whole purpose of the office is to trigger this relationship with God. It isn't to get through the thing. You know, it's like when I was a little boy, I'm sure you've heard this before, that if you started the rosary and fell asleep in bed, then the angels finished the rosary, this sort of thing. But what that was supposed to tell us is that the goal in saying the rosary isn't that you finished the rosary. That's not the goal, that you finish the prayer. Prayer is a relationship and a conversation with God. And if in going through it, a set word hits you or a set phrase, you should sit with that and allow God to speak to you through that. That's the thing it's about. But that's all on God's part. You have no idea, that I think there are environments. There are people who tend to hear God more at the beach, people who tend to hear God more in animals, people who tend to hear God more in conversations with people. There can be all kinds of things. There's no rhyme nor reason to that. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't force it to happen either. You can't make it happen. But it happens in all different things, usually kinds of ones that are peculiar to us. So he says, the watchmen met me, those who go around the city. They beat me, they wounded me, they took my cloak from me, those guardians of the ramparts. And the guardians of the ramparts are like, we'd call it a police force. A police force is around. In the cities of that time, it is against the law. You are by definition a thief if you're on the streets at night without a light. Do you remember the story of the foolish and wise virgins? That the foolish virgins couldn't go out because they didn't have a lamp. You can't go out. Well, this woman has gone to the door to let him in. He isn't there, so she's just gone out in the street. So she's seen as a criminal. And now she speaks to that choir behind her. Okay, we talked about there's the man, the woman, and the choir. Speaks to the choir behind her. And she says, I charge you, daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my love, what should you tell him? Tell him that I am sick with love. Okay? So she says, if you see him, don't let him think that I didn't want to let him in. Tell him that I am sick with love. She just took too much time, but it wasn't to try and get away from it. Now the chorus adds, why is your love better than other lovers? O loveliest of women, Why is your lover better than other lovers to put us under such an oath? So why do you require us to look for this particular person? And what you see there in this choir is the ignorance of what it is to be in love. You know, for a man to be in love with a woman, not just any woman, he's in love with a particular woman, okay? And do the same thing with a woman. She's not just in love with a man, she's in love with a particular man. And this chorus is saying, well, you know, if he's gone, you remember that song, if I'm not near the one I love the one I'm near, okay? And so that's kind of what they're asking. And now she's going to go through a description of him, much like the description that he went through of her. And so she's trying to tell him why she loves him. And again, as we mentioned earlier, with the description that he gave, you give all kinds of things about why the person is important and stuff, but that isn't it. It's the love that you have for the person that makes all that stuff important. You know, she has the most beautiful eyes in the entire world. Does she have the most beautiful eyes in the entire world? Probably not. But she has the most beautiful eyes in the world to you. You know, that it's a whole different thing. And so she goes through this. My love is fresh and ruddy. And I'd like you to know that that's a specific reference. I don't know if you remember when David's father, what was David's father's name?
Jesse.
Huh?
Jesse.
Jesse, that's right. So Jesse was the father of David. And Samuel called Jesse and said, bring in your sons, for God wants one of them to be king of Israel. So they came in. And if you read the text, they go through this list of magnificent qualities, you know, that you'd think they're models, the way they go through. And once they get all through, that's not the one God wants. And so Samuel said, do you have another son? And they say, yes, but he's taking care of the sheep. He's the youngest. And Samuel says, bring him here. And when David comes in, the adjective they use of him is ruddy. That's because they've run out of all these tall, handsome, beautiful. They've run out of those adjectives on the other brothers. So this is a specific reference to David, who is fresh and ruddy, okay? And David is the prototypical Jew. I mean, if you're looking at the model Jew, it's David this way. So he says, to be known among 10,000. And to say, you know, a particular man, if a woman is in love with a particular man, she could quickly pick him out among 10,000. But would anyone else notice that he was better than the other 10,000? Probably not, okay? And if a man's in love with a woman, he just, you know, picture. One of the things I love about that song, and I find it a deeply religious song, is that song Lady in Red, because it's the idea of God fixing on a person, and it's as though nothing's around, anything. The whole universe sort of moves away from the way it fixes on a person. I don't know who sings it, but it's a really powerful song about this idea of fixing and being, and he suddenly realizes that she's looking at him. He suddenly realizes that she's going to dance with him, and he just and I think that's much the relationship. But I think if a person develops well in their spirituality, the beginning thing is this idea that God cares for me, and then you begin to understand God favors me. And then you begin to realize that God is a friend in love with me. And you see it, you know, that one of my favorite quotes from Augustine, he's reminiscing on how different things would be if he was God. I think all human beings do that at times, you know, but how much better things would be off. But anyway, so he goes all through all these things, and then he looks at his own life, and he realizes that if he was God, he could never forgive God what God had forgiven him. And the closing line is, for me, the most powerful non-biblical verse ever written. He says, if I were God, I would choose to be Augustine so that you could be God. And to be able to understand that I am better off that God's God than I even would be if I were God. That in a very real sense, both as a church, as a community, and individuals, we actually have seduced God. It's just a remarkable thing. So I said, his head is golden, purest gold. His locks are palm fronds and black as the raven. This idea of the head being purest gold, if you remember, that's part of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, when the Nebuchadnezzar has this dream interpreted by Daniel. It's a statue, and the head is gold, the body's partly silver, becomes bronze. At the bottom it becomes metal, steel or something. And the feet are half metal and half pottery. And so a rock rolls down from the hill and hits the feet, statue collapses, and it marks the end of the Babylonian community. And God said that so that Daniel could reveal it to Nebuchadnezzar. But the top, the head, is gold. And the idea is that's the power, the strength, the perfection of the community. And again, the idea of the black hair and this sort of stuff. His eyes are like doves beside the watercourses, bathed in milk. And I mentioned to you before that eye difficulties are very prominent in the Mideast. So she's talking about the whiteness of his eyes as going through this. Perched on a mountain rim, the doves perched on a mountain rim. His cheeks are beds of spices, banks sweetly scented. His lips are lilies, distilling pure myrrh. His hands are golden, rounded, set with the jewels of Tarshish. And the idea of golden, I think you know that in the scriptures, they very often speak of people that we would call olive complexion as being golden. So she's describing his body. Tarshish is an area in basically, Turkey. And it's one of the areas in Turkey where they used to find precious stones. I don't think they do anymore. But if you go back into the ancient world, the finding of precious stones, they normally found them in streams. And it took them a long time. I don't know if I told you last time how the first gold mines came to be in California. Well, the way they came to be was, up to that time, everyone panned for gold. That's how you got gold. Then some genius, I don't know who it was, but I know where it took place. It took place in is it Maricopa? What's the word for butterfly? Mariposa. Took place in Mariposa. And the very first mine in the whole state of California is actually on church property in Mariposa. But they were panning, and some genius thought, if there's gold in this stream, it has to have come from something upstream. So they would go upstream and pan the gold until they reached a point where they could no longer pan gold. And they realized something there was putting gold in the stream. And then they started digging into the hills and building the mines. We did the same thing with precious stones, because stones are in a matrix. And so as they're washed out of the matrix, the precious stones, the rubies and this sort of thing, would come down in a stream. And the place they were most prominent in the ancient world that they knew about, place where they were most prominent, to be honest, was India. But the place that they knew most prominent was Tarshish. And so this idea of being able to see these jewels. Now, she goes on into the description. His belly is a block of ivory, covered with sapphires. Again, I don't know whether that would be a good analogy for today, but anyway. His legs are columns of alabaster, set in sockets of purest gold. And set in the sockets of gold, incidentally, is a reference to the temple. If you find out the description that Moses was given about the temple to be built. His appearance is that of Lebanon, unrivaled as the cedars. And again, his appearance is striking. And that whole thing is tied to the fact of she's in love with him. So that makes him striking and very different and everything. It's I thought it was interesting. I went to a play. My sister wanted me to go up to a play with her one time, and it was at there's a theater in San Diego that duplicates a theater where the Old Globe, yeah, duplicates Shakespeare's theater. And it's a very intimate little theater. It's great. But anyway, we went there, and there must have been 70 people on the stage. There were, I would say there were as many people on the stage as you could get in the entire thing. And this whole play is going on. But my sister's boyfriend was in the play, and he was just, supporter way back in the she knew where he was all the time. For me, I couldn't pick him out anywhere, and she knew where he was all the time. And it's because of that the way they look. She says, his speech is sweetness itself. He is altogether lovable. Well, if she gets married, she'll work that out later. Okay. Such is my love. Such is my friend. O daughters of Jerusalem, okay? And again, while it's a great description of everything, that is the description of anyone who's in love. It's not, an objective thing. And the chorus responds with, well, where did your lover go, O loveliest of women? Which way did your lover turn so that we can help you seek him? And she responds, my lover went down to his garden, to the beds of spices, to pasture his flocks on the grass and gather the lilies. Now, do you remember what he had told her back, and we did this a couple days ago, but he told her, if you want to find me, she says, how will I find you? He says, follow the tracks of the sheep, because he was a shepherd boy, and so he took the sheep out. So if she wanted to follow him, all she had to do was follow the tracks of the sheep, and she'd be out wherever he was, with the sheep that time. So that's what she reminds them of. And then she says, I belong to my love, and my love belongs to me. He pastures his flock among the lilies. Again, I'd like you to notice, I belong to my lover, and my lover belongs to me. Notice that in the relationship with God, that I do belong to God, but God does in fact belong to me. That you end up in this relationship with God, and that's the relationship. Like I think it's you see more of this in the Jewish scriptures, but I think it's amazing that when God comes down to Abraham and says he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, they go through this bargaining thing. He says, well, you wouldn't destroy it for just this. And that's not the way you talk to God. That is the way you talk to a friend. And so you see this. I think most of us would find much more power in our spiritual life if we would always consider the fact we're speaking to a friend. And, tell him, I think some people look at God as though we can't really say anything too bad in front of him. We don't want to embarrass him or hurt his feelings or anything, which is baloney. And then other people that just, dump all their problems on him like that. That's not the way you deal with a friend. You tell your friend kind of what's going on, and a good friend will figure out whether you want sympathy, advice, encouragement, whatever, That oftentimes we bring an unsoluble problem to a friend. We don't want solution. We want friendship. It just works that way. Okay, so we'll call it there.